Greetings. I'm Bill Wagner, and I'm here with James.
Hi, I'm James Sturdivant.
We're going to look at some of the code review now for inside areas where the .NET Framework is using inheritance as one of their ways to get a lot of reuse. So we're going to work through some code in a different part of the .NET Framework, primarily part of the web stack. We're going to have 4 different sections here. We're going to look at the MVC controller. We're going to look at the multi-select list as a base class. We'll introduce the lab work for this section. We'll take a break, let you work through and try to come up with your own solution, and then we'll come back and work through the solution we developed. So let's start with looking at the MVC controller. Let James walk us through that and talk about some of the areas that we can work with inside the MVC controller.
Great. So first we'll define what MVC is. MVC is Model View Controller. And so the part we're going to be looking at is the controller, and that's really the part that kind of coordinates the requests that are coming in from the website back to and gathering data and then passing that off through the model to the view, and the view does the display. And so we're going to kind of look at the controller. This is where you're going to be using the base class, the controller, to extend and add your own views, add your own endpoints that you're going to be exploring.
So on a website, like if I've got a set of URLs that I want, each one of those maps to something in a controller. So a URL goes to something in my controller, right?
Right.
Okay, and then it's going to return a view, which is the page that I'm looking at.
Correct.
And because it's dynamic, that model is going to be the data that's displayed inside that view. That something underneath the controller is calculated.
Yep.
Okay.
And so the controller, when you implement your own controller, you're actually inheriting from this base controller that we're about to show. And that base controller gives you a bunch of different features that you automatically begin to use. And so we're going to take a look at what a few of those look like. So down here, I've opened up the controller class. I'm just going to hop into full screen here. And we can see that the controller class actually inherits from a controller base class, and it's getting a bunch of different features from there. If we look down below, we've got a bunch of different objects and class member variables that are being used internally. And so you won't actually have access to these variables here when you're inheriting, but you will get access through them through some of the various properties that we have exposed.
So they're private, not protected?
That's correct.
You can't directly access them or change them. Okay.
Yep. And so you can see down here, although the async manager is private up at the top, when we scroll down, you see that we've exposed the async manager through a get-only property. And so this means that we can actually get access to it, but we can't necessarily write to it.
Okay.
So we'll kind of keep going down through the code here. And some other things that you might be interested in seeing here is the model binders. And so here you see that's a protected class, and so we can actually get access to this particular model here. So
if I've done all client development on desktop, what does a model binder do in the context of a controller here?
Sure. So a model binder takes all of your. So if you make a request onto the website, you're going to be passing a bunch of strings, and so that's the strings that are coming through are just basically key value pairs. And so the model binder.
So that'd be like all the stuff on a URL after the question mark. I've got, this equals something and that equals something else and so on.
Yeah, you got that right.
Okay.
Yep. And the model binder will actually allow you to take those strings and put them into an object inside C# so that you can start to use that object inside your code. Okay,
so my controller methods don't take just strings. I actually get an object that's got those keys and values, and the keys are the names of the properties, and then the values are whatever the value of those properties are.
Okay. You got it.
Okay.
Yep. And so...
but I don't have to write this.
Yes, you're right, exactly. And so this is the kind of code that the base class really brings up to you and surfaces to you. And then also, if you look down here, we'll also see the various route collection. So we kind of talked about where those bits of, like when you make a request, where does it actually end up? What method does it actually look into? And so this has a list of those route collections in there internally, and it's all implemented for you.
So a route is how it maps everything on the URL after my host name to the name of the controller, the method, and the parameters on it.
You got it.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. So you see there's a bunch of other objects in here. If you're familiar with working with a controller, these are all ones that you have used inside. So if you want to get the current user on your system who made the request, you're going to go controller or this dot user when you inherit from this. And so you don't have to worry about where that user is coming from, and you also don't have to do all this extra checking for the HTTP context.
So the controller, that base class, has got all the implementation to look at the HTTP context that comes up as part of the request, and it's figuring out who's logged in, either from a session or from some other provider, and it's giving me this object to know who it is. So it's already done all that work. It could be anonymous. It could be somebody who's logged into my domain. It could be my own site has its own, the baked-in ASP.NET authorization for individual accounts, any of those, and I get this object back that just says who's logged in.
That's correct.
And the base controller does that. So anything I write, I've got access to all that.
You got it.
Okay.
Yep. And so I think some of the other things that you might see in here, there's quite a bit of logic here, particularly in the action invoker. So which action are you going to be doing? Are you going to be calling the get method, or are you going to be calling the post method within your controller? And this is going to do all that logic for you, and so you don't have to actually implement this every time you work with a controller.
So that's part of the HTTP spec. So if anything I type in the address bar, that's a get. And when I've got one of those sites with JavaScript and Ajax or form post, that's coming in with one of those other verbs, right?
You got it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so you can see that there's quite a bit of code in here that when you actually implement your own controller, you're not having to rewrite this code, but you get access to that.
I think that's what I find amazing here. Anytime I do any of the web development with MVC, any of the methods I write are specific to the actions that I want my controller to resolve, right? I've got my home controller, I've got index and about and whatnot, or I've got a controller to look at a catalog, and it's got the list and item details and whatever my domain is, and I don't need to do any of this other stuff. That's all in there because my controller is a controller, right?
You've got it.
Okay.
Yep. So I think the final method here we'll take a quick look at is this execute method down here. This is a method that's actually called through the MVC pipeline, and this is where it's going to actually call your code. And we're not going to go too deeply in here, but what I wanted to show was that there's quite a few different things that it's handling for you. It's loading your possible temp data that you might be using, and that's, say you wanted to store some data between two requests, you would put it into that temp data. And so it's going to actually load that data up for you so you have access to it.
Is that stored server side, or does that go back and forth?
That's stored server side.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. And then it's also going to, if there is no action, it's going to handle handle that for you. And so if so you don't have to worry about handling all those use cases where someone might pass the wrong URL or make the wrong request to the wrong action. They're going to actually they're going to handle this for you and return that 404 for you.
So that would be if somebody goes, /home, so they hit my home controller / some unknown method name. Maybe they're trying to probe my site or whatever. This is going to just give them that default 404. You're trying to find something that's not there. We won't expose the yellow screen of death and say that's not here and any of that sort of thing.
Yep. Okay. And so that's a whole bunch of code that we don't want to have to re-implement every single time, and so it's been put into this controller here.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
And now, so we just derive from controller, and then all that stuff happens, and we just have to implement our other stuff.
Yeah, you've got it.
Okay.
So real quick here, I can actually show a potential inheritance here. If I go to Find All Resources, I should see that they've implemented the...
I think a lot of their test code is going to create real controllers.
Okay,
so
yeah.
I think the test project is going to have a number of them where they create and instantiate a controller that then they use to get at some of the protected methods and so on.
Yep, so we can take a quick chance here and look at this My Controller. It's inheriting it, and this is kind of exactly how you would do it. This is the action name here, it would be method, and you can come in here and start to return a view from this controller. And now I've got all that.
Signature. It looks like that's that's set to be void right now.
Yeah, it would be I
think it's view result. Is that right?
View result. Nope. Well, we'll go back here and we can start to implement our logic inside this controller here, and you see that we don't have to worry about how all that other stuff is being implemented.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, up next, we'll go ahead and move on here.
Yeah. So the other one that I find interesting that we dive into inside the MVC space is when we're building models, there's different kinds of things that we're going to send down that we want to display in a page. And one of the ones that we picked out to look at there is this multi-select list and a single select list. So there's an inheritance hierarchy there where the team decided that one of those is of the other thing. Right. So let's look at the multi-select, which is one of the objects you can use in one of your models to send down as part of the view. And let's look at what's built in there that maps to that particular HTML element.
Yep. Great. So the multi-select list is, if you've ever been to a website and you have a box with a bunch of different items in it, you can select them. That's when you'd be using one of these multi-select lists. And that is implemented as the base class, and later on is inherited by the select list, which only allows you to select a single one. And so you can say a select list is a multi-select list. So we'll take a quick look here at multi-select list, and you can see there's a bunch of different constructors that we're going to be using here. We've kind of seen that before. You can build these out in multiple different ways, but I think the really interesting part about all of this is when we get down to the actual implementation down here, where where we're seeing all the various ways that we can actually access the list. And so here they're checking to see if the list is null or empty, and then returning the data field. And then if otherwise, it's going to get a list with all the value items.
Okay. So we may have this item that's there, this field that's meant to be what gets displayed as part of the objects that we're binding to the list. Is that how that's working? It would have different parts of it that are underneath there? Let's go back and look at that code again.
Yeah, real quick here.
So we're looking at this string value for that data value field. And then we're going to get the items either with it or without it, it looks like.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
And then you can also get all the list items with the value field. And so this is where we're seeing some of that encapsulation that we had seen
Right, so
before.
those two are private. We're going to pull back a list items, but how we construct them is going to be different based on whether it has the data field or doesn't.
Correct.
Cool. Okay.
And so you see there's a bunch of different code in here. And it's very similar but different throughout the whole thing.
Right.
And as we go through here, we're seeing how all of the various groups, if you wanted to be able to get a set of items inside there, this is one of the functions that's implemented internally to get those groups. So we're seeing that throughout the whole thing.
Okay.
And so if we move up to select list, we'll see that select list actually inherits multi-list. And we have a few constructors that are overriding those because we can only select one item in this one here.
So this is sort of interesting. This is a case of inheritance where what we've done is the derived class has what feels like less functionality than the base class.
Yeah,
So we're deriving it by restricting some of the things that you can do.
Yep.
Okay, that's interesting. And let's see how that works.
Yep. So if we go down here, you'll see that you always have to have a selected value. And so you can set that during the construction of the object. But when we come down to the bottom here, almost there.
Once we're past all those constructors.
Yep. You see that we can always, because with the constructor we always have a selected value, we expose this extra object that shows which one is selected.
Right. But now we can't, it looks like we can't change that. Or no, we change it. Yeah, it looks like we can't change it because it's got a private setter. So when we're sending this down, we won't be able to change it once it's been set. So this list has got just that single item selected, and then we're going to get another call back to our controller with a model that comes back if the user changed that and they're submitting something back.
And then we can then set this selected value through that constructor.
So we'll create a new object with a new different selected value when it comes back.
That's correct.
That's how that's working. Okay, so we're really restricting what we can do there because this is meant to be, we're going to create this thing, send it down, and then our controller goes away because it's the end of the request. And then we're going to get another instance coming back, and we're going to have another object that gets created.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So when you create that, when you can only create this through the constructor, you always have to pass that selected value, and that selected value can't change once you've instantiated this.
Okay. Now it looks like once we get to multi-select, okay, it's got methods that will allow us to select multiple things, but once they're selected, it also won't let us change them, right? So you can't really
go back and take a look.
dive in. So because of the way this is set, because we're setting what's there server side, and then when that goes away, with a new request, we shouldn't be modifying it later, because otherwise I'd feel like maybe I can go around this restriction and say I'm going to use just the base class APIs to change what's selected and modify that. Right. But it looks like those weren't part of that multi-select object either. Unlike, and I'm going into this a little bit just because I think some of our audience may be more used to doing things on Windows where we're doing data binding and it's bound in such a way that when the user changes something, it changes the object. Whereas here on the web with MVC, we're creating this thing that we're sending across the wire, and then our server-side objects go away effectively, and then we'll get back a new request.
For each request.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think it's important to get that so that they understand how these concepts work in a slightly different problem space. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Cool. Okay. Now, I think before we go on and introduce a lab exercise, I want to look at one website just because we're doing things now in a different place in an open source project. The ASP.NET Web Stack, at least all the versions before ASP.NET 5, which we're recording this in October of 2015, isn't released yet. It's pre-release. We can look at it, it's open source. But we're looking at the version that's from the currently released version of ASP.NET. And most of that code is still on an open source project on Codeplex, ASP.NET or ASP.NET webstack.codeplex.com. And that's where this code is, where the MVC controllers and so on live. So just if you want to grab a copy of the code yourself and clone this repo to look through some of the things that James just showed you, it's in a different spot than the earlier versions. And with that, let's introduce what we're going to do for the lab exercise to work with inheritance, where we want to look through and extend what we built earlier and talk about and think about how to put that into some common code underneath it. So for our lab exercise, So for our lab exercise this time, we're going to expand that previous lab. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to introduce a teacher into this hierarchy. So each teacher is going to have a name and once again some ID that gets stored in our models. And each teacher has a subject area that they teach. Maybe they teach math, science, or history, or maths if you're from the UK. We only have one math here in the US. Each teacher has a list of titles for the classes that they teach. And as we put that together, think about what could be common with that student object that we already built in terms of both the behavior and in terms of how that could be put together, and is there a common base class underneath that? Mm-hmm. And with that, time for you to go ahead and try to work with a little bit of what we've learned, put in some simple inheritance. We still have a small hierarchy, so it's not super deep and super complicated. And then we'll come back and look at one solution, and then we'll move on and start talking about interfaces.